Hey guys, it's Ben with UpDoc, and today we're going to talk about the three primary career paths that you should consider, or your organization should consider developing. Number one, the clinical or technical specialist. This is probably the most common and sadly sometimes the only career track that we know of in healthcare, at least for clinical professionals. And typically in a structured organization like a corporate healthcare situation or a health system, you have something like clinician level 1 or clinical specialist 1, level 2, level 3, and then specialist. And then every once in a while, they'll branch off into a couple of areas and eventually will lead into track number 2. So track number 2 is a managerial specialist. And you don't think of managers as a specialist, but truly it's a different work lifestyle. You're not really dealing with patient care as much as you are dealing with the day-to-day operations, and you become more of a figurehead and more of a supply chain manager than you really are somebody who manages the clinical care itself. Now, there are some hybrid roles that we see very commonly in outpatient and also in some inpatient settings where you'll have more of a clinical supervisor. They spend 80–90% of their time doing clinical care, and the remainder of the time is doing some of these different one-off things that are on a management level. More commonly now, however, we're seeing that this type of floor-level clinical manager is getting a little bit overtaxed in terms of the roles and responsibilities that have been laid upon them. Now, as the managerial growth track goes, you go from a floor level manager and typically to something like an area or regional manager or a divisional manager. By then, usually they give you the title of director, and then that eventually goes into something like a system director or East versus West Coast if you're in the United States. Eventually, something like a vice presidency will be offered into maybe something of an executive vice president and so on until you reach that top of the food chain, C-suite. The last primary career track you should consider, and that organizations should really consider, is the educational specialist. Now, the educational specialist happens quite a bit in inpatient and hospital settings where you'll have something of a clinical educator specialist that's in charge of making sure that the department as a whole or that the entire, say, physical therapy program as a whole is up to snuff as it pertains to best practice. Now, there are several branches of this that can exist, from the clinical educator into something of an internal consultancy role. We see this sometimes blend into management specialists, which can help staff and mid-level managers better make efficiencies with their people and their processes. Now, of course, we'd be remiss not to mention the academician aspect of being an educational specialist, which is very much part of our professional roots within healthcare. We all went to some type of professional school to be able to graduate with our degree and eventually get our license so that we can practice. So we owe quite a bit to our educators and need for that world to merge with the other two to make sure that the clinicians on the front lines can update our academicians with what is happening, and same thing with our managerial specialists, that they can coordinate between the two to make for best practice in not just clinical care, but also in how we operate as a healthcare system. So if you're watching this video today and you're on the workforce side, you're a candidate, you're an applicant, you're an employee, it's important to map out where you are and where you want to be, and it's absolutely okay to jump between these various career tracks. But be forewarned, you need to make some prerequisite steps depending on what your final goals are. If you're aiming to maybe get into the C-suite of a hospital, you're probably going to need an additional degree, maybe an MBA or an MHA. Similarly, if you really just care about clinical education, you want to make sure that all of your colleagues are finding the very best evidence and the very best techniques and the very best clinical practice patterns to apply to populations of patients, well then really what you need is clinical specialty. Also, if you're watching this today as a practice manager, maybe a practice owner, or a manager within a health system or corporation, it's important to make sure that these three career tracks are laid out clearly so that you take maximal advantage of your human resources. There's nothing worse than having attracted top talent only to see them promote themselves up and away from your organization. That's a lot of potential lost, that's a lot of training lost, and more importantly, that's culture that you lose from your organization to a potential competitors. As always here at UpDoc, we highly recommend that organizations of all types market aggressively to attract and retain top talent. For years, this has been one of the greatest struggles we've seen, especially in physical therapy, but also healthcare at large. So whatever the case is, make sure you map it out, plan it out, and take measurable action steps to reach those goals. I'm Ben with UpDoc. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you at the next one.